How'd you get into D&D? Your friend showed you this mystical booklet and weird esoteric dice you'd never seen before? You wanted to be Legolas, and one day someone in the high school drama club invited you to a role-playing exercise. Maybe you just had a good time watching Stranger Things and you jumped on this curious bandwagon of misfits and miscreants tooling around in these cool tabletop game stores. We've all got our stories about how we first encountered Dungeons & Dragons, and this one is mine. Oh, and this is also Tabletop Alchemy's 1-year YouTube anniversary. Huh. I should have come up with something better to talk about. Greetings, good humans, and welcome to Tabletop Alchemy, where sometimes it's story time, and where we thank our patrons for their kind and generous support. Much obliged. Alright, it's 1981. I didn't know what cool music was yet. My favorite book was Harriet the Spy, and my favorite movie was Empire Strikes Back. I was in the 5th grade at Our Lady of Perpetual Help, a Catholic elementary school smack dab in the middle of a desert, which felt very much like Tatooine to me. One day my friend Alan grabs me at recess, all excited, and tells me he's got this new game we gotta try out. He's got this red box in his hands and drags me over to the walkway in front of our classroom. The rest of the school is all out on the playground doing playground stuff in 110-degree heat. He slaps this box on the ground and opens it up. Now, at this point in my life, I've played all the board games in our family closet. My grandparents' garage. I played cribbage and Yahtzee and Uno and Old Maid and Go Fish. But inside this red box Alan has are thin booklets with wall-to-wall text in tiny font and what look like math tables and lists, and there's some graph paper in there and pencils and weird hollow plastic red dice. They're strange shapes, but also they're really cheap and crappy feeling because they have no weight to them. They're like cheesy prizes at a Chuck E. Cheese or something. Notably, there is no board nor any playing cards in this box. And I'm like, so what is this, man? And he's like, it's Dungeons & Dragons. Like I was supposed to know what that meant. But I have no idea what he's talking about. Let's take a moment to clarify what my setup here implies. I'm 10. I'm in a Catholic elementary school. I'm also an altar boy at the church that runs the school. Most of our teachers are nuns. The only rock and roll songs I've heard are on my mom's vinyl records of the Monkees. I'm probably what they call sheltered. But I don't know this. Nor does Alan. In contrast, Alan's parents are literal Hells Angels bikers. Alright, that might be a little bit dramatic. They were definitely bikers, and there's a 100% chance they belong to a riding group. And there's a tiny chance that group was the Hells Angels. But of course, they've enrolled their kid in a Catholic school, so maybe they're Reformed Hells Angels, or retired Hells Angels. At any rate, Alan's parents were very cool and laid back, and he always had a pretty decent acquisition platform for the coolest toys. Like, he had the Star Wars Death Star playset as soon as it came out. And on top of that, he had all the cool Star Wars figures. And on top of that, he had the Holy Grail. Multiple stormtroopers in addition to all the best characters. I had these two, the mailbox and the bug-eyed guy. Anyway, there we are sitting on the concrete in front of our classroom, and Alan is trying to explain to me how this game works. I'm not even convinced that this is a game at this point. He's telling me I'm going to be this character, maybe a fighter or a wizard, and I'm going to go into this dungeon place. And all I have in my mind is a dungeon cell from some 1960s TV movie or something. Like, why am I going into a dungeon cell? I asked him where the board was, and he says, with a straight face, there is no board. And he's drawing something on the graph paper with his pencil, and I just did not understand what was going on. So, roll this, he says. He gives me that D20. You can fight a goblin, he says. I don't think I knew what a goblin was at that point. Maybe I did. But I sure didn't understand how we got from here's a piece of graph paper and a die to you're fighting a goblin. I try to explain to him that he's not making any sense. He starts flipping through one of the booklets and it looks like a textbook to me. Not even a regular textbook, but like something for college students or professors or something. It was literally impenetrable to me for the 2 minutes I had to look at it. Now, I have a tendency to want to get to the bottom line quickly, like when I don't understand something. And I just kept asking questions like, where's my character? As in, where's my Monopoly top hat? And how do I move? And he's looking at this table and one of the books and saying things like, okay, you got to roll a 12 on that dice there. And I'm like, how do you know I have to roll a 12? And where's the goblin? And then he's like writing out like algebraic formulas to show me how he got to this number 12. And I just was confused. And then the school bell rings and we have to pack up all the papers and cheesy dice and booklets, and Alan's a little frustrated, I think, but you know, we're 10, so whatever. We just go back to class. I had no idea what the game part of the game was that he was trying to show me. I suppose he didn't really understand everything about what he was doing either, but maybe if he'd like acted out how the game was played, maybe I would have got it. But That's probably giving my 10-year-old self too much credit. The whole thing, again, was just confusing to me. But nevertheless, I went home and tried to explain to my mom what Alan had shown me at recess. And unbeknownst to me, there was something going on in the world that I was completely unaware of. I was 10. I didn't watch the news. You didn't either when you were 10.
The witchcraft, the demonism, the spells.
A lot of adults who think it's been connected to a number of suicides and murders.
So what I didn't know was that my mom was already familiar with D&D. And after I told her about Alan and his weird new game that didn't seem like a game at all, well, I was barred from hanging out with Alan from that point forward. I was fairly shocked by this unilateral response. It seemed totally out of left field and I didn't understand. And there was one more surprise coming down the road too. The next day, I rode my bike the 2 miles to school like I did every day. But this time, Alan and a mutual friend of ours confronted me by blocking my path on the sidewalk with their own bikes. And he was kind of pissed. I didn't know what was going on, and he's telling me it's all my fault, and I'm like, what's my fault? And it turns out that the school had forcibly banned Dungeons & Dragons from its campus that very morning. And he was literally the only kid who had brought the game to school. I think he'd been called into the principal's office, like the whole shebang, right? Read some kind of riot act, etc. Again, I was pretty shocked and still did not comprehend why all this was happening. But me and Alan, we weren't ever quite the same friends after that. Now, my mom watches these videos. Hey, Mom. No, I don't know why she does, but she's heard me tell this story before. She and I had the appropriate rocky relationship throughout my teen years, and we're appropriately close now. So, this is just another example of getting some views at someone else's expense. Everything gets funnier with age, like wine or cheese. So I never gave D&D a second thought after that. Never even, heard of it again. My second, and technically my officially lasting encounter with D&D happened 6 or 7 years later. In fact, this encounter was really with the fantasy genre itself, which up to that point I wasn't even really aware of how big of a fan I was myself. I never got into the... Hold on. Let me cast my cantrip of protection from fandom. I could never get through more than 10 pages of The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, so I did not like those books. But on the flip side, I was a huge fan of Peter Pan, Robin Hood, and a guy I worked with at the public library during my first high school summer job gave me his extra copies of the first 4 ElfQuest graphic novels, which I fell in love with, and those were my introduction to the idea that there were such a thing as non-superhero comic books. So I was a fan of fantasy, but I never quite thought of it in that way, until the day I was in the mall bookstore with a buddy of mine. Yep, the classic 80s Walden books. And I spotted a book on the shelf and the cover art just grabbed me. This cover art right here. And my buddy mentioned something about Dragonlance being based on Dungeons & Dragons. I devoured that first Dragonlance trilogy, and then it was time for D&D. My bookstore buddy showed me a couple of his advanced Dungeons & Dragons rulebooks, and I was hooked. Right away this time. I went right back to the mall to another classic store called The Gamekeeper, and I got the Player's Handbook. This one, which I know now is the second printing with the better cover. And I got the second printing Dungeon Master's Guide soon after. Now, I'm going to be honest here. Definitely at the risk of alienating some of you dear viewers. Hey, we all have our aesthetic preferences. What works for you, or works for me, doesn't have to work for everyone. If my buddy had shown me the first printing covers of those books, and those were the only ones available, there's a pretty big chance I would have not been interested. No shade on the artist. I just really like Jeff Easley's work. In fact, I remember later seeing the covers for D&D 3rd edition when I got out of the Army, and I thought they were so cheesy looking, I didn't even consider buying those books. Oh, allow me. I'm a terrible person. I know. I'm just a hack that judges books by their covers half the time. Anyway, I was saving up my ducats from paycheck to paycheck from the movie theater where I worked. One day I'll share some stories from that whole adventure. It was definitely my favorite job. But I'd buy another D&D rulebook as soon as I could afford one. I hadn't actually played the game yet, but I was just all in, making characters and reading the rules and stuff. Eventually I found out a guy I worked with at the movie theater was a dungeon master, and he invited me to a big game he was setting up for new players, with the intention of starting a campaign, or something like that. So I jumped at the chance to play. And it was pretty much a total fiasco. There were too many players, and it took like 3 hours just to get everyone's characters set up. And when we finally started actually playing, it was just a huge, boring mess. It took like half an hour just to get to your turn in combat, right? So I never went back to that group. But that experience of interacting with the game in some fashion was enough to give me a grasp of the basic gameplay process. And that, coupled with the facts that I didn't know anyone else who played and my own personal leanings, led me right into wanting to run games myself. I ended up recruiting a couple of new players from other guys I worked with at the movie theater, and I ran a couple of very small sessions in people's garages late at night after work. And shortly after that, I joined the Army, and I shipped all my D&D books to Germany with me. I ran a small campaign for a couple of months during my stint overseas, and when I got out, during the summer of 1992, I stumbled across Shadowrun 2nd edition. And a group of us, including my buddy from the bookstore, all decided to go to what was my first tabletop gaming convention here in Los Angeles. It still runs every year. It's called Strategicon. The one activity I engaged in during that convention was a Learn How to Play Shadowrun event. And the GM who ran our table was so good at describing things cinematically and clearly that I was just blown away and I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I ran Shadowrun for our group for a year straight, and it was super fun. And playing Shadowrun is how I found out about miniatures, and about how much I didn't know that I needed them. I found out I really liked painting them and using them for the game. And as most things are doorways to others, TTRPG miniatures became a gateway to the discovery of war games like Warhammer and Warhammer 40k, and, the slippery slide had begun. I progressively got into lots of other hobby stuff too, but those are tales for another time. And that's how I got into D&D, and the hobby in general, which I guess further led to this moment right now, where I'm telling you all about it. Which, yes, seems in hindsight like a ridiculous thing to be doing. I don't know why this would be interesting, but hey, maybe there should be a 2-drink minimum for all my videos. That'd help, right? Yeah. Anyway, I guess let me know how you discovered your first tabletop hobby game, especially if it involves scholastic book bannings of some kind. See ya.